When Tokyo fell silent in August 1945, the city's destruction went far beyond the fires and ruins. Beneath the broken streets and the blackened skyline, something subtler but no less powerful had been lost: the taste of sweetness. By the time the emperor's surrender echoed through crackling radios, most of Japan had already forgotten what sugar truly tasted like. For years, the war had drained every ounce of sweetness from the Japanese home. The ships that once carried raw sugar from Taiwan and the Philippines had been sunk by American submarines. The great refineries of Osaka and Yokohama stood idle, stripped for metal or burned to ash in the air raids. By 1944, sugar was a ghost. Housewives scoured markets for substitutes: sweet potatoes, corn syrup, tree sap. Some boiled bark into bitter syrup. Others traded their last possessions for a few crystals of brown sugar wrapped in newspaper like contraband treasure. Children learned to lick the bottoms of empty candy jars just to remember what joy used to feel like. In the final months of the war, Japan was a nation living on substitutes: ersatz coffee from roasted barley, soy sauce from burned soybeans, sweets made from sweet potato starch and artificial coloring. But no imitation could replace sugar. In Buddhist temples, offerings once made with mochi and sweet rice cakes were replaced by simple rice balls, or nothing at all. The absence of sugar became a symbol of the empire's starvation, of the sweetness that had once defined prosperity, now replaced by bitterness and loss. When the bombs stopped falling, Tokyo did not wake to peace. It woke to hunger. The Allied occupation found a city of starving civilians, a people surviving on 1/3 of pre-war calories. Markets were empty, and even rice, the sacred grain, was a luxury. The official ration was barely enough to keep a person alive. Yet in all this suffering, one craving dominated letters, diaries, and black market conversations alike: sugar. Housewives wrote in their journals that their children asked not for toys or clothes, but for a spoonful of sweetness. Soldiers returning from the front searched for it like treasure, trading medals and cigarettes for a few grams. It became an obsession, not merely a food, but a memory of comfort, a connection to the time before bombs and hunger. The Americans who entered Tokyo were struck by this obsession. When U.S. occupation forces arrived, they brought chocolate, condensed milk, and candy, partly as rations, partly as gifts for children. Those small, brightly wrapped pieces of chocolate became tokens of another world. Photographs from 1946 show American soldiers handing out candy to crowds of barefoot children in the rubble of Ginza. The smiles in those photos became symbols of a new Japan, but they also revealed something deeper. To the Japanese, that taste was more than sugar; it was a revelation. Children who had never known sweetness cried as they tasted chocolate for the first time. Their parents watched in silence, torn between gratitude and shame. Newspapers later called it the chocolate rain. The American occupation authorities, known as SCAP, quickly realized that Japan's food crisis was catastrophic. Yet, when they drew up emergency import plans, sugar was not considered essential. It was a luxury item, not a survival need. Shipments focused on rice, wheat, and soybeans. The Japanese government pleaded for more sugar imports, arguing that it was vital for morale and nutrition. SCAP officials dismissed the request at first, until reports came in describing the psychological effects of sweet deprivation. Teachers wrote that children were listless and depressed. Doctors found that the lack of sugar, combined with malnutrition, caused dizziness and slowed recovery from illness. In hospitals, nurses dissolved sugar cubes into water for the weakest patients. In factories, women fainted from exhaustion. The craving for sugar had become a national condition. The black market filled the gap. In Tokyo's Ueno and Shinjuku districts, sugar was traded by the gram like a controlled substance. Dealers smuggled small amounts from the ports or bribed occupation soldiers for military supplies. A single kilogram could cost more than a month's salary. It was wrapped in newspaper, weighed on improvised scales, and guarded like gold. Families risked arrest to buy it, and police raids sometimes turned violent. In one report, a group of women attacked a policeman who had confiscated their sugar, shouting that they would rather die than live without it. Sugar was no longer just a food, it was rebellion, survival, and nostalgia all at once. For children born after the war, the first taste of sweetness often came from American aid. In 1946, the U.S. began distributing powdered milk and cocoa through school lunch programs. The Japanese government added sugar to these rations, calling them hope meals. Teachers described how the smell of cocoa filled classrooms like incense, how children sat quietly, waiting for their cup of chocolate milk as if it were a sacred ritual. That sweetness, fragile and foreign, became the taste of a new era, a mixture of defeat, dependency, and renewal. But the sugar shortage itself continued long after the occupation began. The destruction of Japan's sugar industry had been total. The refineries in Tokyo Bay were gone, the cane fields in the colonies lost. Even the machinery for refining imported sugar had been melted down for weapons. By 1947, Japan's sugar production was less than 5% of pre-war levels. Imports were strictly rationed and often delayed by shipping shortages. The government attempted to produce synthetic sweeteners from starch and coal derivatives, but the taste was so unpleasant that people preferred to eat their rice plain. As sugar became a symbol of American abundance, resentment also grew. Some intellectuals argued that the obsession with sweetness represented Japan's moral decay. In essays published in early post-war magazines, writers warned that sugar was a drug for a defeated nation. They claimed that children addicted to candy were losing their traditional spirit. Yet in the streets, ordinary people ignored these warnings. They were too busy surviving, too desperate for small joys. A piece of candy could lift morale more than any speech about virtue. In 1948, when American shipments of sugar finally increased, Japan's mood began to shift. Bakeries reopened, and confectioners who had hidden their tools during the war began to experiment again. Tokyo saw the return of small sweets, bean paste cakes, rice candy, sweet buns filled with red bean paste and a little imported sugar. These modest desserts sold out within hours. For many, they symbolized recovery, proof that life could again include pleasure. The smell of sugar cooking on the street once more replaced the smell of ash. The Tokyo sugar catastrophe gradually faded into memory, but its effects remained etched into Japanese culture. The deprivation had changed the national relationship with sweetness forever. In the years that followed, the first generation of candy makers after the war, many of whom had grown up without tasting sugar at all, built an industry obsessed with flavor, color, and abundance. Companies like Morinaga, Meiji, and Lotte flourished in the 1950s, using sugar as the symbol of post-war joy. Candy commercials filled with laughter and Western music played on new television sets, turning sugar into the taste of peace itself. Yet behind this sweetness lay a darker memory, the time when a nation's most powerful craving could not be satisfied. In letters written decades later, survivors still recalled those years as the bitter hunger when they dreamed of sweetness more than bread. One woman remembered the day she tasted real sugar again. A single spoonful stirred into tea, smuggled from a soldier's ration. She wrote that it made her cry, not because it was delicious, but because it reminded her she was alive. The story of Tokyo's sugar catastrophe is not just about food. It is about the collapse of an empire and the rediscovery of humanity through something as simple as taste. When everything else was gone, pride, cities, armies, the craving for sweetness remained, stubborn and pure. It was the hunger that outlived the war. By the early 1950s, the memory of wartime hunger still haunted Japan, even as the streets of Tokyo began to glow again with neon lights and the hum of new factories. Yet the obsession with sugar lingered like a ghost that refused to leave the table. Housewives still rationed it carefully, measuring each spoonful as though it were medicine. Schoolchildren still treasured candy wrappers, folding them into tiny origami charms for luck. The black markets that had once traded in sugar had shifted to more modern goods, cigarettes, fabrics, transistor parts. But in quiet corners, old dealers still kept a jar of brown crystals under the counter. It was no longer contraband, but a relic of a time when sweetness was the rarest luxury in the world. Sugar had become a kind of collective memory. For many Japanese, it symbolized the journey from ruin to recovery, a reminder of both humiliation and rebirth. In homes rebuilt from ashes, a cup of tea sweetened with imported sugar meant more than comfort. It was proof that the worst was over. The act of dissolving sugar into hot tea became almost ceremonial, as though each crystal carried the memory of the empire's fall and the nation's slow resurrection. In post-war literature, sugar appeared again and again, in poems, short stories, and novels, as a metaphor for lost innocence, for small joys in the ruins, for the fragile sweetness of peace that might vanish at any moment. As Japan's economy began to rise, so too did its appetite. In 1952, the Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the occupation, and with it came a surge of independence, economic, political, and culinary. The nation that had once starved under rationing now rushed to rebuild its food industries. Sugar imports flooded in under new trade agreements. The Ministry of Agriculture began promoting sugar as a symbol of progress, publishing cheerful pamphlets showing smiling housewives baking Western-style cakes and cookies in modern kitchens. For the first time in decades, Japanese families could buy sugar freely, without ration cards, without fear. Yet for older generations, the taste still carried a trace of guilt, as though every sweet bite was borrowed from the hunger of the past. During these years, the confectionery industry exploded. Companies like Meiji, Morinaga, and Fujiya saw their sales rise tenfold. Candy that once seemed foreign, chocolate, caramels, chewing gum, became part of everyday life. Children of the 1950s grew up in a new sugar age where sweetness was no longer a dream but a fact of life. Yet even as Japan embraced this abundance, its leaders worried about moral decay. The older generation, shaped by the austerity of war, saw the new sugar craze as a sign of indulgence. Newspapers warned of the sugar children, a term used for kids obsessed with sweets and Western foods. Doctors worried about tooth decay and diabetes, but the deeper fear was cultural, that Japan's disciplined spirit was dissolving in sugar, just as it had once melted in fire. Meanwhile, in the kitchens of Tokyo and Osaka, a quiet revolution was underway. For centuries, Japanese sweets, wagashi, had relied on subtle flavors, red bean paste, rice flour, chestnut, and fruit. Now, these traditional confections began to evolve, blending Western and Japanese styles. Bakeries began selling cream-filled pastries and sponge cakes layered with strawberries, drenched in sugar syrup. The fusion was more than culinary. It was symbolic of Japan's new identity, modern, hybrid, yet still distinctly Japanese. A generation earlier, sweetness had been the mark of defeat. Now it was the taste of reinvention. But memory has a way of hiding beneath abundance. Beneath the neon lights and the sugar-coated smiles of the 1950s, there remained the quiet knowledge that everything sweet was built upon years of bitter hunger. Those who had lived through the war still spoke of sugar with reverence, almost fear. In some homes, mothers refused to throw away even a single grain that spilled from the bag. Children were taught that wasting sugar was a sin. Some elderly women still dissolved their sugar into tea and drank it silently, eyes closed, as if communing with ghosts. For them, sweetness was never simple again. The government archives from the period tell the rest of the story in numbers. Between 1946 and 1955, Japan's annual sugar consumption rose from less than 100,000 tons to over 1 million. Imports came from Cuba, Taiwan, and the Philippines, nations once tied to Japan through war and empire, now partners in trade. The irony was striking. Japan, which had once conquered sugar-producing colonies for its own refineries, was now buying sweetness from the very lands it had tried to control. But few noticed the irony. They were too busy eating. The candy companies became cultural icons. Meiji launched milk chocolate in bright red wrappers, marketed with slogans like "The Taste of Happiness." Morinaga introduced caramels said to melt away the sadness of the past. Their ads featured smiling families, beautiful women, and children with shining eyes, all symbols of a country that wanted to forget hunger. The post-war boom had begun, and sugar was its unofficial currency. In the rural towns, where rebuilding came slower, sweetness spread more quietly. Traveling vendors sold small bags of sugar door to door, along with tins of condensed milk and cocoa powder. In schoolyards, candy was handed out at festivals, and children lined up for hours to get one piece. The laughter that once vanished in the smoke of war returned, flavored with sweetness. Every bite was a small rebellion against the memory of scarcity. Yet the story of the Tokyo sugar catastrophe wasn't just about recovery. It was also about what Japan became because of it. The deprivation had left deep marks on the national psyche, shaping everything from dietary habits to cultural identity. In a society that had once prized self-restraint and simplicity, the post-war sugar boom revealed a new vulnerability: the human need for comfort after trauma. Psychologists studying post-war Japan wrote about sweet nostalgia, a phenomenon where foods associated with childhood or peace brought emotional relief. In some hospitals, doctors prescribed sweetened drinks to patients suffering from depression, claiming it stimulated hope. The craving for sugar had become a craving for normalcy itself. Meanwhile, abroad, the world began to notice Japan's transformation. American visitors in the 1950s were struck by how quickly the country embraced the Western diet. Coffee shops, cake shops, soda fountains, all symbols of American life, appeared in Tokyo and Yokohama within a decade of surrender. Yet even as Japan adopted these foreign tastes, it refined them, turning simple sweetness into art. The Japanese talent for precision and presentation transformed desserts into aesthetic experiences. What had begun as a desperate longing for sugar evolved into one of the most sophisticated confectionery cultures in the world. But even amid prosperity, the echoes of catastrophe could still be heard. In 1956, an old warehouse was discovered near Shinagawa Station, filled with rusted barrels labeled Emergency Sugar Reserve, 1945. The barrels had been forgotten during the chaos of surrender. Inside, the sugar had hardened into dark blocks, unrecognizable and useless. When the story appeared in the newspapers, people were struck by its symbolism. The reserve, meant to save the city, had turned to stone while the people starved. Some journalists called it Tokyo's sweet tomb. In interviews years later, survivors still spoke of sugar not as a flavor, but as a symbol of what they had lost and regained. One man, who had been a boy in 1945, recalled watching American soldiers hand out candy and thinking they were gods. Another remembered how his mother used to stir a spoonful of syrup into his rice on his birthday, whispering that one day he would eat as much sugar as he wanted. For him, that promise became the measure of peace. When he finally bought a cake for his own son in 1952, he cried while eating it. It wasn't the sweetness that made him weep. It was the memory of waiting for it. By the late 1950s, Tokyo had transformed into a glittering city of abundance, but the sugar catastrophe had already written itself into the nation's collective memory. It became one of those silent stories that no one needed to tell because everyone remembered the feeling of it. The dull ache of craving something simple, the shame of hunger, the astonishment of tasting sweetness again. Japan's modern prosperity was built on those small rediscoveries, on the way people learned to savor what they once took for granted. And so, the sugar that once symbolized loss became the flavor of hope. The catastrophe had reshaped not just the economy, but the very soul of a nation. The people who once licked empty candy jars now filled them with color, invention, and pride. The same children who had stared wide-eyed at American chocolate grew up to build the factories that made Japan the confectionery capital of Asia. The taste that had vanished in fire returned as the taste of progress. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Tokyo's sugar catastrophe was the way it revealed the fragility of civilization itself. For in the end, it wasn't bombs or politics that defined Japan's defeat. It was the absence of sweetness, the moment when a nation's most basic comfort disappeared. When sugar returned, so did the idea that life could once again be beautiful. By the beginning of the 1960s, Tokyo no longer looked like the city of hunger that American soldiers had marched into 15 years earlier. Streets once filled with rubble were now alive with cars, neon lights, and billboards advertising candy, soft drinks, and pastries. The economy that had been shattered by war had turned into one of the fastest growing in the world, and yet, beneath the glittering surface of the new Japan, there remained the quiet pulse of something deeper, a collective memory shaped by deprivation. For those who had survived the long years of bitterness, sugar was more than just a commodity. It was an emotion, a measure of how far they had come from the ruins. In the markets of Shinjuku and Ginza, the sweet smell of baking drifted through the air. Western-style bakeries offered butter cakes and custard cream puffs, and lines of customers stretched down the street. Housewives bought boxes of cookies not just for their children, but as gifts, proof of stability, of middle-class life, of participation in the new prosperity that seemed to define the 1960s. It was as if the entire nation had turned its trauma into appetite. Confectionery consumption tripled in a decade, and sugar imports surged to record levels. What had once been an unattainable luxury now became an everyday pleasure. But for the generation that remembered the catastrophe, each bite carried a ghost of the past. The paradox of post-war Japan was that the very sweetness people now celebrated had once been their greatest symbol of despair. Old diaries and letters from the 1940s began to be published, and readers were shocked by the simplicity of the suffering described. Housewives wrote about boiling tree bark for syrup or trading heirloom kimonos for a handful of sugar crystals. These writings became part of Japan's growing fascination with its own wartime experience. The contrast between that hunger and the abundance of the 1960s was almost surreal. Social critics began to call it the sweetness paradox, a cultural phenomenon where the nation's prosperity was haunted by its memory of starvation. Film and literature of the period began to reflect this duality. Directors like Yasujiro Ozu and writers like Fumiko Enchi used food, and especially sweets, as metaphors for memory and loss. In Ozu's quiet domestic dramas, the act of offering sugar for tea often marked reconciliation or remembrance. In one scene, a mother carefully drops a cube of sugar into her son's cup, her hand trembling, a gesture both maternal and historical. The sugar was not simply sweetness, it was the taste of survival, of everything they had endured. Japanese audiences recognized that meaning instinctively. They had lived it. As prosperity deepened, Japan's relationship with sugar became more complex. In 1964, the Tokyo Olympics marked the nation's return to the world stage. Visitors from around the globe marveled at the city's transformation, its efficiency, its cleanliness, its energy. But what most foreign journalists noted was how westernized Japan's diet had become. Coca-Cola flowed freely in vending machines. Ice cream shops lined the streets near Olympic venues. American companies saw in Japan a paradise for sweet products. Hershey, Nestlé, and Coca-Cola all expanded their presence. For many Japanese, these foods represented progress, modernity, and global connection. Yet in older neighborhoods, the elders shook their heads. They saw children with candy-stained lips and worried that the spirit of restraint, the wartime virtue of gamen, endurance, was being drowned in sugar. Health concerns soon followed. By the late 1960s, doctors warned that the nation's sugar consumption had risen too quickly. Tooth decay became a common childhood illness, and nutritionists coined the phrase sweet sickness. Yet even these warnings carried an undertone of pride, the idea that Japan had finally joined the ranks of rich nations where abundance could be a problem. In a strange way, cavities became a badge of progress. The country that had once starved now worried about eating too much. In homes across Tokyo, families preserved the rituals of sugar with quiet reverence. Morning coffee sweetened with 2 spoons instead of 1, a slice of castella cake served at tea time, a candy slipped into a child's school bag before an exam, all small gestures of love and luck. Sugar was no longer rationed, but it was still cherished. Housewives who had grown up during the war taught their daughters to store sugar carefully, to never waste it, to treat sweetness as a gift. Even in abundance, they remembered scarcity. The confectionery industry, aware of these emotional currents, began to weave nostalgia into its products. Advertisements in the 1970s often featured scenes of mothers and children, evoking the simple joy of sharing sweets across generations. One famous Morinaga commercial showed a grandmother handing her grandson a caramel candy and whispering, "This is the taste of my childhood." The slogan, "Sweetness is memory," captured a truth that resonated deeply. Sugar had become the nation's collective memory, crystallized in taste. But Japan's love affair with sweetness also had an ironic consequence. As the country industrialized and urbanized, it began importing massive amounts of sugar from abroad, reshaping global trade patterns. The same tropical nations that had once suffered under Japanese occupation now supplied its sweetness. Cuba, Thailand, and the Philippines became Japan's primary sources of raw sugar shipped across oceans to refineries in Yokohama and Kobe. Historians later pointed out the poetic symmetry. The empire that once tried to conquer these lands for sugar now depended on them for survival. Sweetness, once a symbol of dominance, had become a symbol of interdependence. By the 1980s, Japan had achieved what economists called the sweet peak. Per capita sugar consumption reached its highest level in history, Supermarkets overflowed with desserts, candies, and soft drinks. Foreign observers were astonished by how deeply sugar had woven itself into Japanese culture. From traditional mochi to Western-style cakes, from children's festivals to corporate gifts, sweetness defined celebration. Yet the memory of the catastrophe never entirely disappeared. In interviews, older Japanese still spoke of sugar with the same reverence one might reserve for religion. They remembered the smell of American chocolate, the first taste of condensed milk, the way sweetness had returned to their lives like sunlight after darkness. Even in the booming economy, museums and historians began to revisit the story of the sugar crisis. In the 1980s, an exhibition at the Edo Tokyo Museum titled Sweetness and Suffering displayed wartime ration cards, rusted candy molds, and photographs of children in the ruins clutching chocolate bars. Visitors wept as they walked through the exhibit. One elderly woman left a handwritten note on the guest wall. "We learned to value sweetness because we knew its absence." That simple sentence captured the entire emotional arc of post-war Japan. The story of sugar was, in the end, the story of Japan's humanity. When everything else, ideology, empire, pride, had collapsed, it was the small, universal hunger for sweetness that connected people again. Sugar became the thread that linked survival to memory, defeat to recovery, bitterness to beauty. Even decades later, when Tokyo's skyline glowed with prosperity, that thread remained invisible but unbroken. By the 1990s, as Japan entered the era of global brands and convenience stores, the meaning of sweetness began to shift again. For younger generations born long after the war, sugar was no longer sacred. It was cheap, ubiquitous, and taken for granted. But in the quiet corners of the city, in traditional tea houses, in small family-run bakeries, the older meaning persisted. There, the act of sweetening tea or offering a confection was still a kind of remembrance, a silent ritual connecting past and present. Every grain of sugar still carried the weight of history, the memory of what it meant to crave it. And though the world outside had changed, though Tokyo now stood as a symbol of modernity, its streets filled with glowing advertisements for every kind of sweetness imaginable, the city's soul still remembered the days when sweetness was life itself. The sugar catastrophe had not simply ended, it had transformed into something eternal, woven into the collective taste of a nation that once learned, through hunger, to treasure joy.